The ghosts of college students have haunted the halls of this school for years. Let me explain. Now, before we begin, I want to say that there are two different stories about the great Amherst haunting. The one that is most widely accepted by people who study paranormal phenomena, and one that is more popularly known in the general public. The problem is that the popular version of the story isn't actually true. So while I will address both versions of the story in today's video, it'll become clear which one I believe is the true version. On February 29, 1862, a young man named Dwight Philbrick entered his dormitory room at Amherst College, only to find a book lying on his bed with an inscription inside addressed to him. He picked up the book and opened it to the page where the inscription was found. It read, "To Dwight Philbrick from his affectionate sister Mary, who died September 13, 1861. Dwight knew there was no sister of his who could have possibly written the message, as he was an only child." Of course, Dwight immediately assumed that the book had been written by a ghost. Now, if you know anything about ghosts, then you already know that whenever something like this happens, further investigation is required. And so, while Dwight didn't really put much stock into the note, he did decide to look into it a bit. He went down to the college archives and discovered that Mary Philbrick, the author of the book, had indeed died on September 13, 1861, but she wasn't related to him. She was the daughter of a former janitor at the college who worked at the college during the year 1861, but who died the following year. But why would a ghost send him a book? Well, he couldn't possibly know, and so he decided that the only way to find out was to spend the night in the room that Mary had died in. And so that's what he did. He spent the entire night alone in the room with the door closed, unable to sleep due to the intense fear he felt from the thought of being watched by an all-powerful spirit. In the morning, when the sun finally rose, he opened the door and left the room and instantly noticed a strange change in the atmosphere. The room had been filled with such oppressive dread the night before, but now it was filled with sunshine and laughter. Students were everywhere, enjoying their day off from classes. As he walked around, he heard them talking about how cool it would be if a ghost were to appear. And they weren't just saying that for fun either. They actually believed that ghosts existed. This, of course, only added to the eeriness of the situation. Dwight then went back to the archives to try and discover what room Mary had died in. Unfortunately for him, he couldn't find any records of which room she'd stayed in. But he did find her obituary. Her obituary stated that she'd passed away in a room in the college dormitory. Now, realizing that she'd died in a dormitory, he looked at the other students staying in the dormitory and realized that there was one student that was missing. That student was Charles Williston, and Charles's room happened to be right next to Dwight. While Dwight was looking through the archives, someone knocked on his door, and when he opened it, he found a very concerned Charles standing on the other side. Charles had been looking for Dwight because he had just returned from spending the night in his room, and he was looking for Dwight to compare notes. See, while Dwight was spending the night in his room, Charles had been spending the night in his, and during the night, he had heard some strange sounds coming from the next room over, as if someone were walking around in there. In the morning, upon opening Dwight's door, he found that it was locked and bolted from the outside. He tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. When Dwight and Charles compared notes, they realized that neither of them had locked their doors, yet in the morning they were both locked. To make things even stranger, when they searched the rooms for anything that may have made the sounds they heard, they found a woman's shawl under the bed. No one had ever seen this shawl before, and it appeared as though it had just come from nowhere. Charles and Dwight then decided to stay in Charles's room for the night, locking the door behind them. When they woke up, they opened the door to find that it was locked once again. They searched the room for the source of the sound, but found nothing. This time, however, they noticed that a chair had been moved. For the third night in a row, the boys decided to stay in the room. This time, however, they brought along 2 other students, making 4 in total. They locked the door and prepared for bed. As they lay in their beds, though, they began to hear chains dragging metal moans. Then they saw a translucent figure dragging herself closer and closer to their beds. Now, being the brave men that they were, they followed the spirit as she approached them until she came close enough for them to see her face. She was an emaciated old woman with long flowing hair covering her face. One of the boys reached out a hand to touch her, but when he did, he fell to the floor in pain. His hand was badly injured, as if he'd touched a hot iron. Startled by this, they chased after the apparition, but she disappeared down a hallway. They then ran after her. At the end of the hall, they found a flight of stairs leading to the basement. They continued to follow the sound as she dragged herself down the stairs. When she reached the bottom, they followed and saw that she disappeared through a hole in the wall. On the other side of the hole was a dark, dank dungeon filled with cobwebs and dust. The apparition was nowhere to be seen. In the middle of the room was a small table, and on the table was the same shawl that they found under Dwight's bed. Upon touching it, one of the boys cried out in pain. They then left the room and didn't return for 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, they returned to the dungeon, bringing with them a priest. As the priest stood in the center of the room, he heard chains dragging metal moans. A ghostly figure then appeared and approached the priest. She told him that she'd been buried alive and that she wanted to be dug up and laid to rest elsewhere. The priest agreed and helped her to dig up her grave. When they reached inside, however, they found no body. Startled by this, the priest and the boys fled the room. When they returned the next day, the hole had been filled in and the dungeon was once again just a dark, dank storage room. To this day, the ghost of Mary Philbrick haunts the halls of Amherst College. Or does she? Well, not really. You see, the story that I just told you is almost entirely false. Almost every single detail of it is fabricated. You see, the story of the Great Amherst haunting was actually written by a man named M.A. Foster and published in the Springfield Republican in 1899. Foster wrote the story as part of a writing exercise given to him by his English professor at Amherst College. His professor had asked him to write a fictional story about ghosts, and so he did. He wrote a story so convincing that many people actually believed it to be true. In fact, when the story was published, it received a large amount of attention. Readers wrote to the newspaper asking for more details about the story. Many people also claimed to have witnessed the ghost of Mary Philbrick for themselves. In response to the attention the story had received, Foster eventually came forward and admitted that the story was, in fact, a work of fiction. Of course, this led to a lot of embarrassment for the people who had written to the newspaper asking for more details, as well as for those who had claimed to have seen the ghost. But this didn't stop the story from continuing to spread. People who had never heard Foster's confession continued to claim that they'd seen the ghost of Mary Philbrick for themselves. And so here we are today, over 100 years later, with people still claiming that the ghost of Mary Philbrick haunts the halls of Amherst College. So while I believe that there definitely could have been a ghost in the room, the story as it's told today isn't true. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and consider subscribing.